Ambassador P.S. Raghavan, a former Indian ambassador to Russia from 2014 to 2016, a former chairman of the National Security Advisory Board, and one of India's most eloquent voices on Russia, on the crisis in Russia and in that part of the world. And today, of course, we're discussing the crisis in Ukraine. On Monday, Russia's parliament allowed or gave permission, not that President Vladimir Putin needs any permission, for Russia to integrate two parts of eastern Ukraine, which is the two oblasts or provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk. Now, these will soon be integrated into the Russian Federation. The president of Russia, Putin, has already sent so-called peacekeepers there. But in his long drawn-out conversations with Western leaders in these last several weeks as the crisis in Ukraine has unfolded, Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, has just canceled a meeting with the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. The Security Council at the UN has met to discuss the crisis. India also spoke there. But before I get ahead of myself, let me welcome Mr. Raghavan to ThePrint. Mr. Raghavan, welcome.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you. Thank you.
So let's talk about the crisis in Russia. And that's all, many of us have been talking about these last few days. Today, what is the situation on the ground? How do you assess Vladimir Putin's actions? Do you think he has blinked by not invading, within quotes, Ukraine, or is this the first step, the integrating of the provinces of Lugansk and Donetsk into Russia? Is this the first step for an invasion?
No, let's start with what you said at the end. Actually, they have not integrated Luhansk and Donetsk into Russia. They have actually declared recognized the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk. And
first step towards integration, but perhaps anyway, we'll leave it there for now. Yeah.
No. You see, today, if you integrate Luhansk and Donetsk, then there is no more to say actually on the subject of Ukraine. I'll tell you why as well.
Okay.
But what they've done is they have actually signed a treaty of mutual assistance, friendship, cooperation, and mutual assistance with each of these two republics. That presupposes that they are independent and will remain independent.
Okay.
And that if there is a threat to their integrity, Russia will move in to support it. Mm-hmm. In fact, it is similar to what they've done with South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia in 2008.
Okay.
Now, if you ask this question of what is Putin doing, has he blinked? Does he want to do this as a first step? I think we need to step back and look at rational possibilities. I mean, if you decide that Putin is an emotional and irrational human being out to conquer the world, then I think there is no discussion because nobody can say what he's going to do next. Mm-hmm. But if one proceeds from the assumption that there is some rationality in his decision-making, and if one accepts that his objective is actually to integrate Russia into Europe, to reverse the history of the last few years where Russia has been isolated by the West and has really been cut off from Western links and the Western economies, and therefore has had to depend entirely on China.
Okay.
Then you have to assume that the steps he will take will move towards that, and that what he is doing today is a kind of a pressure point, is a negotiating ploy in order to make the West do what he thinks he can make them do.
But Mr. Raghavan, isn't that a bit rich in the sense that you don't almost go to war in order to pressurize the person on the other side to do what you want him to do?
Actually, it seems to have worked. As long as he had all these troops piled up on the border, you had the Western countries, of course, threatening harsh sanctions in the event of an invasion into Russia, but also saying that, look, we're willing to meet you halfway in your demands. They talked about the Minsk agreement, they talked about the mutual security guarantees, they talked about how they can move short-range and intermediate-range missiles away from the contact point between Russia and NATO. And they, while we can't give you a guarantee that Ukraine will not join NATO, Ukraine is not joining NATO anytime soon. And they said it in many different ways. The German Chancellor said it, the French President said it, the American President said it, and then Blinken and it works. So even while making these harsh comments, they were actually saying we can meet you halfway. Look also at the reaction to what has happened yesterday. Mm-hmm. The recognition was, of course, condemned by everyone.
The recognition of Donetsk and Luhansk.
Yeah, the recognition of Donetsk and Luhansk was, of course, condemned by everyone.
Okay.
But, the full range of sanctions have not unfolded.
Well, the first sanctions have been put into place.
But you see, the original statement was that if you have any invasion into Ukraine, now this is an invasion into Ukraine if you send troops into even into Donbas. Technically, Donbas is part of Ukraine.
That's right.
But now you're making this distinction. They're saying, Russian troops have been there all along. They've been there for the last 7 years. And they're just adding a few more troops. They're peacekeepers. So you're trying to find a way out of the harsh sanctions that you promised for total invasion into Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And now you say that, okay, I'll do it when they take the next step, if they take the next step.
So the West is trying to find a way out, and therefore you feel that Putin's brinkmanship has succeeded.
You can see, no, I'm not saying it has succeeded. I'm trying to analyze why he's doing this brinkmanship.
Okay.
Brinkmanship always has this danger of taking that one step over the brink.
Right.
And you're operating there at that stage where the brink is not very far away. Mm-hmm. But what I'm saying is that as of now, even the West is pussyfooting a bit, if you look at it. Mm-hmm. The sanctions that have been imposed, look at the sanctions that have been imposed, actually. You have the European Union, of course, sanctioned all 351 members of the Duma.
Right.
Which means they can't travel to Europe, and they probably, I'm not sure whether asset freezes are involved in this or not. It's not been clarified. Mm-hmm. The UK and US have sanctioned banks, but sanctioned banks which are not fundamental to Russia's financial functioning. It is not the frontline bank. It's not Sberbank or VTB or any of the other banks, mm-hmm. right? And they have said they will cut Russia off from the sovereign debt market. Russia has not been in the sovereign debt market for quite a while now because it has piled up $635 billion of foreign debt, of foreign exchange reserves and gold.
But the Nord Stream pipeline, the gas pipeline from Russia into Europe.
Yes, that also sounds much better than it actually is, because the Nord Stream pipeline has not yet been certified.
Yeah, it's completed, but it hasn't started. Yes.
Not a single cubic meter of gas is going through the Nord Stream 2. Mm-hmm. And what they have said is not a cancellation of the project. Very clearly, they made the distinction. It's a pause. It's a pause in the certification of the project. Mm-hmm. So it is nothing irreversible. Essentially, therefore, and also, while Secretary of State Blinken said that he is not going to meet Foreign Minister Lavrov, he did not rule out diplomacy. He said diplomatic path is still available. And what's even more curious, the Ukrainian foreign minister in his press conference last night with Secretary Blinken, he said we want to follow the path of diplomacy.
So they don't want any more confrontation with the Russians either.
See, actually it is pointless for everyone. And that is what I'm arguing, that if Putin is a rational human being.
Is Putin a rational human being?
If he is not a rational human being, then we should not be talking at all, mm-hmm. because then you can't predict anything. But if you can see what he has been doing, if he has been ruling a country for 21 years, a country of the size and the location of Russia, one has to assume that there is a certain element of rationality that drives him. And if you see what all he is saying, and what he has been saying for the last many years, the Russian version of making Russia great again, the Putin version of making Russia great again. So there is a method in what many people think is madness and emotion. I mean, they think that it is emotion that drove him into Ukraine. I don't think it's emotion.
What do you think it is?
Yes, I think, you come back to these three issues that Putin raised with Biden and with Putin raised with US and NATO. Mm-hmm. Besides Ukraine not joining NATO and the mutual security guarantees, the third and very important item was the Minsk agreement. Mm-hmm. The Minsk agreement meant giving this Donbas region an autonomous position, an autonomous status guaranteed in the Ukrainian constitution, then holding elections there, and then thereafter the Ukrainian troops being allowed to come to the Russian border. That's basically the essence of the Minsk agreement.
Okay.
When actually, after the June summit, Biden summit of President Putin, when Victoria Nuland, the Undersecretary of State, went to Moscow, there was a very clear indication that the Americans, who had actually been seen to have been holding up the implementation of the Minsk agreement, that the Americans had agreed that the Minsk agreement should be implemented in the form in which the Russians felt the Minsk agreements provided. And she actually made a statement on Ukrainian TV at that time that a special status for Donbas is the way to implementation of the Minsk agreements.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, and also, you see, even the Secretary Blinken in the UN Security Council said this, that we support the Minsk agreement, full implementation of the Minsk agreement. We support the Normandy process, which is, of course, France and Germany who are broken the implementation, and so on. What seems to have happened between then, there was a meeting on February 10 of the contact group of the Normandy group of maybe at the political observers level.
Right.
The Russians got the sense that everyone was backpedaling on the implementation of the Minsk agreement.
Mm-hmm.
And what seems to be the case now, you also saw actually the president of Finland said on TV the other day, and Finland, by the way, as it's here very close to the ground on Russia, as you know, they're very close to Russia. It was geographically very close to Russia. Anyway, what he said was that the Minsk agreement is the major sticking point.
So, Mr. Raghavan, sorry to interrupt you, but let me start by saying that you believe that Putin is a rational leader. But if you look at the Indian press as well as the American press, and especially the American press, which describes him as the sort of very irrational person, and none other than Joe Biden, the US president, said just 24 hours or so ago, who in the Lord's name does Putin think gives him the right to declare new so-called country on a territory that belongs to its neighbors? And every intelligence analyst in Washington, D.C., worth his or her salt, would say has called Putin all kinds of names, including in the Indian press, which has accused the Russian president of revanchism, of saying that he wants to integrate or to bring back the former Soviet Union. What do you make of this?
Number one, calling President Putin names is a national pastime in the media and has been so for the last many, many years. So let's put that aside, because how people are characterized in the media is not necessarily the basis on which you make policy or judge a person's ability. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's true of any political leader. So let's put that aside. When you talk about what President Biden said, that is correct. But it does not mean that Putin is irrational. I mean, it's an absolutely correct point that nobody has given the right to Luhansk and that independent republics. But if you're not doing what is right doesn't mean what is rational.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a fine difference, isn't it?
In his judgment, he's doing it to promote what he believes is the national interest of his country. And what I think he's trying to do is to still apply pressure in order to implement the Minsk agreement.
Go ahead.
What you need for the Minsk agreements is to secure that line of contact between the Donbas region and the Ukrainian forces. And the presence of additional peacekeepers would enable greater ability separatists to do that. Now, whether or not as the in particular has the political will to implement the Minsk agreements, we have to wait and see. That we do not know whether that will happen. But essentially, what he's doing through this incursion is to reinforce the Minsk agreements, not to break it.
Mr. Raghavan, President Putin, I mean, listen, like you just said that what Joe Biden has said is not wrong, actually. And that's the crux of the matter, isn't it? That's the nub of the matter, which is that Putin cannot wake up one day. Okay, it's not one day. He's been talking about this since 2000, since Bill Clinton came to Moscow, and he offered to integrate Russia with NATO. We know that history. But even so, he cannot just say that, these parts of Ukraine, which is an independent sovereign country, should now be part of Russia, or in the future could be part of Russia, because they're majority Russian speaking. 800,000 of the 4 million people in the Donbas already have Russian passports. Another 1.2 million people are supposedly waiting in the queue. I mean, no leader has the right to do this about another sovereign country.
No, I'm not saying right. But what we are doing here is we are confusing morality with rationality. It is not moral. I didn't say it was moral. I didn't say it was right. I didn't say it was in accordance with international law. All of it is not. But he is doing that with some objective in mind. And great powers, big powers breaking international law is not a new phenomenon in our political international order. All big powers break international law when they believe it is in their national interest, or when they believe they can get away with it. I don't need to enumerate cases of whether it is the US or Russia or China or other big powers violating international law and explaining it in moral grounds and sort of getting away with it. So let's not confuse morality with rationality.
But in your view, do you think Putin is trying to bring back at least a semblance of the former order, which is perhaps not the whole Soviet Union again, but, parts that are like-minded, whether it's Belarus or parts of Ukraine, like in the Donbas? I mean, in 2024, when he goes to elections again, when the presidential elections are held in Russia, he could very well say that, Belarus, which is sort of another Slav nation like, or majority Slav nation like Russia, parts of Ukraine, again, yes, Russian-speaking, Donetsk and Luhansk, and I've brought them together again.
Actually, if you've been to Russia in the recent past, my feeling is that the people of Russia are not particularly bothered about getting Ukraine into Russia or Belarus into Russia. They're more bothered about literally their bread and butter issues. Okay. And bread and butter issues are beginning to bite in Russia these days. Therefore, which is another reason why foreign adventurism is not going to be popular in this country. So this is not the way in which he's going to win an election. He may better win an election if he makes the accommodation with the West, which President Biden offered to him in June of last year. And they had these discussions which were leading towards that. Look, let me put it in the broader context. Where were we after June? What was actually happening? Mm-hmm. Very clearly, President Biden was offering to President Putin the hand of, not quite friendship, but accommodation, if you like.
Right.
Where what America's side of the deal was that they wanted to sort of resolve the conflicts in Europe, reduce America's engagement in Europe and in this part of Asia, the West Asia and so on, in order to be able to focus much more on their domestic issues, the number of domestic issues that Biden is engaged in, and China, the principal adversary. Mm-hmm. So this was the deal, basically, that I want to enter into some kind of a modus vivendi with Russia so that we can move forward on what we consider is important now. Putin's response to that, and by all this, the totality of what Putin has been doing, is his response to that saying, yes, I would also like a modus vivendi with the West, because after all, the West had completely ostracized Russia for the last 7 years. So to get back into the Western fold, to get back into a meaningful economic engagement with the West, because also the lack of investment and technologies, Western technologies in Russia, was beginning to bite. Mm-hmm. And so, if you want Russia to be great again, you also need Russia to become a more robust economic powerhouse than what John McCain said, a gas station masquerading as a nation. Mm-hmm. So Putin is well aware of this. And therefore, the point he was making was that, okay, if we have to have this modus vivendi, let us also have some kind of an equilibrium in the European security order in which Russia, have a place. After all, Russia is largely a European country. Mm-hmm. So all of this is the seeking of a security equilibrium in Europe, which suits Russia, which Russia believes is in its interest. And the drama is unorthodox. Actions are unorthodox. They're not necessarily in accordance with international law. I'm not saying they're in accordance with international law. But this drama is meant to drive home the point that you need to also accommodate Russia's interests in order to have this modus vivendi that then promotes cooperation. This I think, is a larger picture.
But then in that case, I mean, it's certainly not, his actions are certainly not orthodox, because you cannot be, you're saying that the quality of life is dropping, but then you cannot revive the economy and sort of go eyeball to eyeball with the Americans or with the larger West. You can't do both things at the same time. But Putin is certainly not the type to sort of put his head down, like Deng Xiaoping once said, and make Russia great again via the economy. He would much rather do these unorthodox actions.
No, that's not entirely true. Actually, if you see his speeches over the last many months, he has focused a lot on the economy and the need to revive the economy, need to revive the high-tech sectors of the economy, because it is in the new economy that Russia is actually falling behind because of its break off from the West. Mm-hmm. So he is quite keen on that. No, you see, actually, I think much of what we see is more sound and fury than actually action on the ground. And the objective, I should think, again, assuming rationality and assuming a logical, rational progression of what he's been trying to do, the idea would be to resolve this issue. The idea would be to get off this eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation and get to that same modus vivendi which Biden promised to Putin in June of last year. And by the way, you talk about Putin's irrationality, emotional, etc., etc., etc. You go back to Biden's press conference in June, when he said that I see him as a rational person who is actually trying to promote the national interest of his country. And actually, some of the goals which I said that Putin has, Biden actually laid them out in his press conference, that he wants to regain economic connection with the West, he wants to be accepted in the West, he wants to create a distance between Russia and China, because he feels that China is squeezing Russia, and that he wants a certain level of autonomy from China. All of this was said by Biden of Putin after meeting him in June.
So then what happened in 6 months?
And some of it was repeated, by the way, on December 7th or 8th. He had his long telephone meeting on December 7th.
Right.
And the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, again described the conversation as purposeful, constructive, businesslike, and that rational. So, they can.
Then what happened? I mean, in 6 months, you're painting a completely.
I'm talking about June. I'm talking about December, not even 6 months.
That's
in
right.
December, Jake Sullivan said that. So
what happened, in the last 8 weeks? Is it the American advisors that are undermining their own president? What happened? Or is it Putin who just, yeah?
I think it is neither. You see, in order to get for example, take the Minsk agreement. If you want to deliver the Minsk agreement, you need to actually reconcile a number of conflicting interests. It's not so easy. America is not.
Does Putin want the West to recognize that he is an equal partner in Europe's security architecture, or the world?
Of course.
And that's what this is all about.
No, this is about the Minsk agreement. I think what has happened with the Minsk agreement is that the US has not necessarily been able to reconcile all the conflicting interests in the implementation of the Minsk agreement. The Ukrainian government is definitely not on board. It doesn't like the Minsk agreement in its present form. A number of other countries like Poland and some of the Central European countries do not like the Minsk agreement in its present form. France and Germany are willing to implement it, but that's only if America can lean on the rest of the countries to make implement the agreement in the form in which it would be acceptable to Russia.
Okay.
Where we stand.
Right. So let's talk about China. At the Security Council meeting on Tuesday, in which India also participated, and India, in fact, expressed deep concern, refused to condemn Russian action. But China also doesn't say very much. Where do you think China's been very quiet, actually. Do you think it's laughing its way to the bank? Because if China is America's principal adversary, how do you look at this triangle?
Absolutely. I mean, China, any kind of a face-off between Russia and the West suits China to a T. That's exactly where China would like Russia to be. Engaged, in fact, it's where China would like Russia and the US to be. which is US bogged down in Europe because of Russia. Russia in a standoff with the US, because of which it will face sanctions, because of which it will face political isolation, and it has to fall back on big brother China. So China then bestrides the world like a colossus as the superpower counterpart to the US, and all is extremely well for China. That's exactly,
does Putin understand that?
Putin understands that very well. Biden said that Putin understands that. You'll go back to June. Biden said that.
If Putin understands that, he also sees how then does he, where does he then place China? Because, this whole argument that Russia is a junior partner to China. And, we've talked about that over and over again. But how does Putin, who wants an acceptance or a recognition of Russia's sort of big power status, how does he look at this relationship with China?
No, hang on. Big power status is a different thing. Actually, your foreign policy objectives have to match your national abilities, your national strength. Mm-hmm. So Russia cannot become a great power overnight if its domestic realities do not match up to it. So which is why, you talked about this economic, Putin understands perfectly well that unless Russia becomes an economic powerhouse without being solely driven by oil and gas, it's not going to become a great power. And that is why he needs this link with the West. And the other thing about China, you cannot disengage from China. The dependence on China is great. Economic links with China are great. Politically, China's support is required. That political support from China will be less required only if you are able to reach a level of accommodation with the West that reduces the threat from the West. And you're nowhere there. So all of this drama would eventually be aimed at trying to reach an accommodation on terms of equilibrium, which is why I'm saying that it doesn't make sense for him to go up to Kiev. What does he do going up to Kiev?
He would rather lean, you're saying something very interesting. Putin would rather lean in favor of the West in order to sort of have a joint or a united front, even an informal one, against China?
No, that's going too strong. I mean, that's putting it too strongly. United front against China is not possible.
Okay.
And that is not the US objective either.
Mm-hmm.
You see, as long as the US can deal with China without having to deal with Russia plus China as an adversary, US should be happy. That combining Russia and China as an adversary becomes more difficult in geopolitical terms.
Who is America's biggest adversary?
America has identified China as the biggest adversary now for Trump did it and Biden has taken on that quite comfortably.
But then the last few weeks, we've only heard the American press demonizing Putin. So I don't understand.
No, look, please separate the press from the government.
Mr. Raghavan, you know that the press reflects a lot of what the government thinks, including in our own country.
Not always. And the press is a little behind the thinking of governments always, because especially in this case, if you look at what President Biden did in June, when he decided to go to Geneva to meet President Putin, mm-hmm. The American press was unremittingly hostile. It was hostile through and through. And the kind of questioning, again, you read the press conference in Geneva, the line of questioning of the American media was very hostile.
I remember that. And Biden said that, let's give Putin a chance. But in the last few weeks, all that the American press has talked about is a potential invasion of Ukraine by the big bad bear, which is the Russians.
You see, that is because the government also said it. In fact, it was a very strange manifestation the last few months where the American leadership was predicting Putin's behavior, including, that the troops are going to come in here, the invasion is going to take this particular format, that it will be artillery with firepower, with air power, air cover, etc., etc. So there's something quite extraordinary in the manner in which it sort of unfolded now, which has not happened before. But all of this, I think, belies the fact that while this was going on, there was so much. See, there's a difference between 2014 and now. 2014, when the Crimean annexation took place,
right,
when actually the West just cut off all communication with Russia. That has not happened now. Through all this, the dialogue at various levels have been going on continuously, whether it is at the American, Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor.
But that's a victory for Putin then, that the dialogue continues.
It's a victory for diplomacy. I mean, why should you look at talk as a victory for one or the other? Because you're now falling into the same Western trap of saying that if you talk to somebody, you're giving him a victory, that you're treating him as your equal. Okay. That's not the way diplomacy works. You talk because you want to get something out of him, and he talks because he wants to get something out of you.
Okay.
And also, let me say one more thing. Don't underestimate the existence of back channels. You look at what is there over ground, the conversations that are taking place when Macron rings up Putin or Scholz goes and visits. Don't underestimate that the possibility of people just picking up the phone and talking to various contacts in the other country. It happens far more often than we think, and particularly with countries of this size and with the long experience of the Cold War, it's quite conceivable that there are many back-channel communications, many more back-channel communications than there are front-channel communications, if you like.
I think that's a really good point. But let me ask you the India question. And by the India question, I mean the Kashmir question. Now, a lot of people have said right now, okay, Jammu and Kashmir since 2019 has been integrated formally into the Indian Union, but which, Pakistan, of course, has not recognized. But let me play devil's advocate and ask you. Now, similarly, just like in the Donbas or in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, you have Putin saying today that you want to implement the Minsk agreement, which is to implement the special status that these two regions were given according to the Minsk Declaration in 2014. Now, the same would apply or has applied until 2019 to Kashmir. Jammu and Kashmir had a special status. So tomorrow, if some other country says, hey, listen, I'm going to recognize Jammu and Kashmir as a separate republic, an independent republic, I mean, how is India going to react to that?
There's no question of India reacting positively to anything of that sort. By the way, there's a big distinction between a special status for Donbas and a special status of Jammu and Kashmir. The special status of Donbas is something which the international community, if you like, wants the Ukrainian constitution to incorporate. Whereas Jammu and Kashmir's special status is part of the Indian constitution. So there's a big difference between the two. And, if a country has to declare a part of another country as independent, in a way, it requires no excuse. It can do that as a sign of hostility. So any country that recognizes, say, any part of India, including Jammu and Kashmir, as independent, is basically committing a hostile act towards India. And that's the way you will have to interpret it, and that's the way you have to deal with it.
Absolutely. So similarly, if this is what Putin has done towards Ukraine would interpret it as a hostile action.
Of course, Ukraine interprets it as a hostile action. Ukraine interprets it as a hostile action. Much of the world says that it's a violation of international law, which it is, in a sense. Actually, it is not a violation of international law in the sense that you have not actually invaded that territory formally.
That's right. You recognized it as independent.
Yeah. So you've made a statement sitting in your country. So
but Putin is shrugging his shoulders and he's saying, listen, let the world say what it feels like. I'm going to implement, or I'm going to look for the implementation of the Minsk agreement that was signed 7 years ago. Okay, so let me come to you.
Yeah. He's not only saying that, he's also saying that the UN Security Council approved the Minsk agreement.
Okay.
The UN Security Council approved the Minsk agreement, and in statements of the US, France, Germany, and everyone in recent past, they've all given their unwavering support for the Minsk agreement.
But Mr. Raghavan, the question is why 7 years later? I mean, he annexed the Crimea in 2014. He did what he had to do, the Black Sea Fleet and all of that. But why bring it to a head today or, the last 6 months?
Because the political compact that America offered to Russia happened 6 months ago. Because all of this flowed from the June summit between Biden and Putin.
And then
it is then that this possibility, before that, in any case, they were not talking. There was acrimony, there was extreme acrimony.
So if Biden offers this compact to Putin, then what's the whole problem about?
Because Putin says that I also have my side of the compact. Biden said that I want to have accommodation with Russia. So Putin says, yes, that's fine. But what do I get out of it? I need peace in Europe. I need integration into Europe. That's my side of the contract. You want to have conflict-free Europe. I want to have my pound of flesh in order to have a conflict-free Europe.
Okay.
You see, a compact is what two sides want.
Right. So let me ask you the India question.
The possibility opened up only when the June summit took place. Before that, there was no possibility. Before that, there was acrimony across geographies, from the Black Sea from Baltic Sea to the Black Sea to the Caucasus to the Caspian, even right up to Afghanistan.
Okay, let me ask you the India question. Now, it's quite interesting that at the Security Council, India's permanent representative, Mr. Tirumurti, and earlier as well, have refused to condemn Putin's actions. They've expressed deep concern, but have stopped short of condemnation. What does that mean?
Well, I see no reason for condemnation at the moment.
Why?
Because you have said, and in fact, I think the PR statement was very balanced. And the PR statement now, the PR statement in the UN Security Council a few weeks ago when the Minsk agreement was being discussed, you have to accept that all sides have legitimate security concerns.
Mm-hmm.
This is something that has been accepted by everybody as well. Even the West accepts that Russia has legitimate security concerns. What are these legitimate security concerns? It's a matter of definition where they differ. Okay. So when you're looking at Ukraine, NATO, Europe, Russia, US, all of them have legitimate security concerns, and you're not getting equilibrium until those security concerns are addressed in some form of an acceptable manner. And you see all this as manifestations of a move towards establishing that, or a struggle to establish that. So there is no reason to now condemn one or condemn the other. And you do have good relations with Russia, you do have good relations with the US. Your condemning Russia is not going to improve, is not going to solve any problem anywhere, besides souring relations with the US. So what is the point?
Souring relations with Russia if you condemn
Russia. Yes, with Russia. So what is the point? Whereas to say that, you need to have diplomacy, and by the way, even while imposing sanctions, President Biden says the door is still open for diplomacy.
No, but one second, Mr. Raghavan, right from 2014, when Putin annexes Crimea, and at the time the Manmohan Singh government was in power. This is March 2014, so before the elections, before Prime Minister Modi came to power. Now, even at the time when the annexation takes place, then National Security Advisor Shiv Shankar Menon says India understands why Putin did that. Then until a couple of years ago, when there was a resolution at the UN on human rights violations in Ukraine, India voted along with Russia. So I'm saying across governments, you have voted in favor of Russia, actually not just abstained, but you voted in favor of Russia at the UN and not against and against Ukraine.
It's not against you. Again, actually, each of these situations were different. 2014 was actually a country which annexed a part of another country. That was
and you recognized Russia's legitimate interests in that annexation.
No, we did not do it formally or officially. We did not do it formally or officially. Look at what happened.
Not formally. It was the statement that Mr. Menon made.
He did not make a statement. Let me explain to you what happened.
Okay.
Prime Minister Manmohan Singh telephoned President Putin and said that India has its concerns about territorial integrity and sovereignty. He put on record India's concerns about territorial integrity and sovereignty, and then went on to say that he hopes that it will be the issue will be resolved in the interests of all parties. That was the India's formal statement in the form of Prime Minister talking to President Putin.
Okay.
NSA Shiv Shankar Menon, in his informal remarks to the media, he said, well, I understand what they're doing. After all, they also have their legitimate security concerns.
Right.
That's how it was said. So
Sure.
the understanding was expressed, but at a level which is below the official level. So that it was careful, it was subtle, it was nicely done, but the message went across. Now, that was an annexation. Today, Russia has recognized another country's independence. It has not annexed that. And that is why I mentioned it at the start. The integration of Luhansk and Donetsk should not be part of the Russian agenda. In fact, it would also add more economic headaches for Russia. So this is a different issue. Now, on other issues, wherever you have issues of substance, if you can respect your relations with Russia to the extent that it does not hurt other countries, you should try to do so. I've been saying this actually repeatedly. You treat all your relationships as joint ventures. Joint ventures where you have certain shared interests, where and where you do not have shared interests, you do not deal on those subjects. Other joint ventures deal with.
Is that because India is so dependent on Russia's defense, on the defense equipment that Russia supplies to India? Is that one of the reasons, including Indian troops fighting with Russian armor on the line of actual control? I mean, there's no fight right now, but facing off against Chinese troops.
No, yes, that's one of the reasons. Of course, the defense cooperation is a very important part of the relationship with Russia. But let's also not forget that there is an entire continental flank on India's north, where India has to interact with Russia, China, and other countries where the relationship with Russia becomes important. To put it another way, hostility with Russia in that continental flank can increase your strategic challenges hugely. So Russia is not simply important only because of the defense cooperation. I think there are other geostrategic and geopolitical reasons why you need to have a broad-based engagement with Russia. Not least of all, if you want to reach Central Asia through Iran. Again, it's the Russia, Iran, India, INSTC.
Are you concerned that the Russian and the Chinese are coming closer together?
That will always remain an Indian concern. But that is again another reason why you need to have Russia have sufficient stakes in its relationship with India to make sure that it does not act with China in a manner inimical to India's interests. So that is another important reason to keep. India can't keep Russia and China apart, but India can make sure that India-Russia interests are strong enough that Russia-China interaction does not act against us. And that's, again, another reason why India should be working towards a US-Russia accommodation, because US-Russia accommodation also similarly works towards, to a certain extent, reducing Russia's dependence on China and therefore creating that distance between Russia and China, which will obviously help India-Russia relations.
Okay, now let me ask you absolutely the last question, Mr. Raghavan. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan is going to Moscow, the first visit in about 30 or so years. What do you make of it? Do you think that this is a coming together of an anti-Quad, a China, Russia, Pakistan sort of informal arrangement against the Quad, which is, of course, India, US, Japan, and Australia? And Mr. Jaishankar has just had a meeting of the foreign ministers of the Quad. How do you look at this?
Yeah, this anti-Quad is like Christ and Antichrist. But we like to put these things in nice boxes.
You have to understand, you have to explain things too, and that's what journalists.
But they don't work in nice boxes like that.
First, tell me about Imran Khan's visit to Moscow.
Yeah. So no, that's why I'm saying that to say that this is an anti-Quad is raising it to a much higher level than what it is at the moment, what it looks like at the moment. Russia does want to develop relations with Pakistan, in a sense independently of India, because also, I come back to the original point, or the earlier point about joint ventures. Exclusivity of relations no longer hold. We have relations with the US, developed relations with the US, which is very strong, even while maintaining relations with Russia. There's no reason why Russia should not want to expand its influence in South Asia with its relations with Pakistan. And then, of course, it uses Pakistan for the Taliban in Afghanistan. It also wants to economic contracts in Pakistan. That's fine.
Right.
You see, we cannot object. Certainly, we cannot object to any country's relations with any country. We cannot object to Russia and Pakistan getting together in this manner. We note, of course, that this is an advance in their relationship. We note also that there are other links, between their militaries in terms of training and in terms of exchange of strategic doctrines and so on, all of which we should always keep in under scrutiny. The point really is that, again, it's much like Russia and China. As long as the relationship does not develop in directions which are inimical to our interests, and as long as Russia does not step on our core interests, I think you cannot really object to Russia developing relations with Pakistan or anybody else.
Mr. Raghavan, this is a primary conundrum, isn't it? India and Pakistan have absolutely no relationship. I mean, you've just had the Indus water commissioners go to Pakistan, a delegation for the first time. I think in 3 years, there's been some interaction. So, we are not talking, India and Pakistan are not talking to each other. Now, India and Russia have a good relationship. So for the Russians and the Pakistanis to come together, I get your point. You cannot interfere in somebody else's friendship, but it will cause you some concern or some heartburn, perhaps.
No, heartburn is a bad emotion in international relations. It's not something that you indulge in. You have to be rational. You have to be hard-headed. You have to see what's going on, and you have to understand what's going on and deal with what's going on. So, this whole drama about my best friend is running off with somebody else, with my enemy. I mean, that's not the kind of spirit in which you approach international relations. You see, and this is not the first time that it's the first time that the Pakistani Prime Minister is going to Russia. But the Russian engagement with Pakistan has been quite intense for quite a while now. And President Putin has been talking to Prime Minister Imran Khan on the telephone quite frequently, especially during the period when the Americans were leaving Afghanistan, before, during, after. There have been a number of telephone calls that have taken place. They have met in third countries on the fringes of other multilateral organizations. So what the symbolism is in the Prime Minister actually going to Moscow and being received in the Kremlin. Well, I don't know if he's going to be received in the Kremlin or in the in another of whatever it is. But that is the symbolism. Or in President Putin going to Islamabad, as he no doubt will in the foreseeable future. I don't see that not happening either. That will also happen. It was meant to happen a couple of times in the past. Once it was rumored that it was India's objection that held him back. I don't think we are in a position to make that objection, nor is Russia would Russia be willing to accept that objection if we made it. So, well, that's how adults, consenting adults have to carry on the way they carry on.
I think that's a great phrase, that consenting adults have to grow up and perhaps accept each other's relationships. On this note, Mr. Raghavan, thank you so much for your time, for speaking to me about all these complex issues, or seemingly complex issues, although you've sort of broken them down and made them sound very simple. But thank you again. We'll be watching the Russia-Ukraine-America crisis unfold over these next few days and weeks, and I will come back to you for more explaining. Thank you for this.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Pleasure to be with you. Thanks.